I used a Winsor & Newton folding paint box that holds the water and the paints with palettes that fold out, and 3 watercolour brushes. That's a size 6, a size 0 and a 000 to paint this watercolour of Kim Kardashian. Up until this morning, I didn't know what she looked like. I asked the various ladies who were floating around who would be a famous person to paint. I don't watch television, so I wouldn't know who's who. But apparently she's very famous and a lot of people would recognise her. So this is a first attempt on very cheap paper, and I shall do several attempts until I eventually paint what I think is a reasonable likeness. Essentially, all I do is mix up some very faint watercolour, faintest tone in the face, and perhaps the faintest tone in the hair, and I paint a shape that's roughly like an egg with the pointy side down, and modify this towards the shape of the face. I tend to put the eyes in fairly early. The eyes are about halfway down the egg, and they come on 4 points. So if you take the distance across halfway down the face and you cut it into 4, that's a line in the middle that will be in the middle of the nose, and a line between the side of the egg and the middle of the nose, and that will be the middle of the eyeball. You have to be a bit careful not to confuse this with where the eyes are looking if the eyes aren't looking straight towards you. In this case they are, so you can pretty much say, yep, that's where they are, and you then use the placement of the eyes to work out the distance across the sides of the nose are and the sides of the mouth are, and I tend to try and work out how far down the nose is going to be, either by holding a measure or the brush up in the air in front of the model or the picture and marking off with my thumb how far down, and then marking that off on the painting, or in this case just guessing. I think overall I made the face a bit short, but I worked this out so that I felt I was looking down on her. I don't think this one's going to be a very good likeness. I need practice to get a good likeness. I'm not too bad at painting buildings, even interiors, and I've done quite a bit of painting difficult interiors over the last few years. The most demanding one I think was Canterbury Cathedral, and the palette I have here, that's the different colours I developed mostly to paint Canterbury Cathedral. I would say that the stonework there and the colours here and face tones go fairly nicely. I added an orange to paint some black people because I realised that the skin tone required orange, but I couldn't get anything like a likeness. I did quite a bit of painting in cafes, and what I want to do during this coronavirus pandemic is to learn to paint a likeness quickly enough to populate the people in my pictures inside cafes with people who are a reasonable likeness. This is really about having a bit of fun. So I can say to a group of people at a table in the cafe, do you mind if I sketch you? I'm learning to paint, and the people will either say yes or no, and if they say yes, then I will try to sketch them in looking like they do. I would expect to aim for faces that are about a quarter of the size of this one, and I would hope to get the time down. This video is time-lapse recorded in an eighth, so it took me about an hour and a half to do this sketch, and my aim is to be able to do sketches like this in about 5 minutes, a quarter of the size. Coming back to the sketch, once you've got your egg in and your eyes in, probably the bottom of the nose, distance down, roughly where the mouth is, and the hairline round the face, and a few bits to indicate where the outside hairline will be. The main thing seems to be getting the tone right. So it's shading tones that are important. Coming across to the palette, when you're shading, this tends to be a mixture of blue and brown. It doesn't seem to work if you use black and mix it up with watercolour, so that if, say, you've got a yellowy pinky colour for the face and you add a bit of black to it, you don't get good shading, whereas if you use a bluey browny colour. The other thing I use apart from the paintbrushes and the palette is a piece of tissue, and I use a tissue to clean the brush between colours so I don't muddle them all up and get bits of blue and bits of yellow and so on, and to dab bits off of the painting. But the shading seems to be the important thing, and things like the nose, which look as though they ought to be rather difficult, they sort of pop out of the shading. I think the human brain has a propensity to make faces out of things. So perhaps looking at the cracks on the ceiling, you see a face. So I don't think I have to be as good at this as it looks, because the person looking at it turns my shapes that are near to a face into a face. You can't photograph the inside of a mask. It's just not possible. You can try, but what you actually see is the outside all the time in the photograph, because the face is made by the brain. So the tones, these tones I was using for Canterbury Cathedral, I have a yellow which is top left of the palette, and this is called Naples yellow. It's very similar to the wall paint that you put on walls called Magnolia in terms of its colour, and I use lemon yellow, which is pretty obvious, lemon colour, and I use yellow ochre, which is a sort of brown, and I use a brown called Van Dyke brown, which is very, very dark indeed. and I use that to make up these dark tones. I use various blues depending on the mood I'm in. In the palette, I've got cobalt blue, I've got cerulean blue, which is a bit like a dusty sky type of colour, and I use a very, very fierce blue, which I forgot the name of, but it'll crop up now and again. I know where the paintings are in this. I do use black, and in the face tones I use white gouache. These are things you're not supposed to use in watercolour, but there you go. Whether I'm getting much of a likeness here, I'm not particularly sure. I don't think it matters that much, because looking at a video, the mistakes people make are going to be as interesting as the successes. This is a bit like looking at someone else's holiday photos. It's quite fun if they're not there, terribly boring if they are. So you can sit there and say, oh, look at what she's wearing, if they're not there, or whatever amuses you. I put her in a swimming pool like David Hockney because I can't really bother to do the body.